Being unjustly accused of something is a terrible thing to experience. If you've ever gone through that, even as a kid, there you are in school, and the kid next to you is messing around, and you're telling him to knock it off, and then the teacher just sees you talking and yells at you instead of the kid next to you that's been doing all of that. And some of you have been in that position, and some of you have been the ones that were provoking them. If you've ever been even in that kind of situation, you know the sense of unfairness about that, and just how it doesn't feel right. But if you're accused of something more serious, then that becomes really a traumatic experience. Imagine being accused of something that is a capital offense that you didn't do. The sense of injustice, of how unfair that would be overwhelming. And the emotions that would provoke, or could provoke at least, could be so overwhelming. Emotions of anger, of fear, of depression. All of those would be natural reactions to a situation like that, where you're accused of doing something that you didn't do. Something that you didn't do. And your life is online because of it. That's the situation that the Apostle Paul is facing in the record that we're going to be looking at tonight. And you can turn to Acts chapter 24, but it's going to be a little bit of time before we get there. In our country here in America, we have in the Constitution of the United States the Bill of Rights. And the Fifth Amendment of the Bill of Rights is what people often refer to as double jeopardy, the protection against double jeopardy, where that amendment states that no one shall have to be put in jeopardy more than once of having their life on the line. No one in our country can be tried more than once for the same offense. A complete trial at any rate. And that's there because it recognizes how much of an ordeal it is to go through a trial like that. Going through a trial is a great trial. The Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts, with these charges, these accusations that have been made against him, not only has to have his life in jeopardy on one occasion, not just simply one trial, but before this is all said and done, on 5 separate occasions he will have to make his defense against these charges that have been brought against him. 5 separate times. He directly answers the mob in Acts chapter 22, 1-22, which we saw, the mob in the temple that made these accusations against him that were wrong. And that then becomes the basis for the subsequent trials or tribunals that he's put into. He's on trial before the Sanhedrin, the ruling body in Jerusalem, in Acts 23, verses 1-10. We saw that record. Tonight we'll be looking at the tribunal before Governor Felix in Acts chapter 24. That will be followed by another tribunal before the governor Festus in Acts 25. And then also beginning in Acts 25 in verse 13 and carrying into chapter 26, his tribunal before King Agrippa II. Of those 3 tribunals before Roman authorities, Felix, Festus, and Agrippa, those 3 are all Roman appointees. 2 of those 3 were held before someone who was related to Herod Agrippa I, who was the man responsible for the beheading of James, one of the sons of Zebedee, and the imprisonment of Peter. So Here in the record we'll be looking at with Felix, towards the end of the record, he brings in his wife Drusilla. Drusilla was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. Later, King Herod Agrippa II is he will be in front of, is the son of Herod Agrippa I. And with him at that time, when Paul has to give his answer to Agrippa, is his sister Bernice, obviously his sister, also a daughter of Herod Agrippa I. And they are the great-grandchildren of Herod the Great, who was the ruler that tried to have Jesus Christ killed right after he was born. I have a couple of teachings on all of these Herods because it gets kind of confusing when you're reading about these different Herods in the Bible. There's a number of them that are mentioned in the Gospels, as well as a couple of them that are mentioned in the book of Acts. And I refer to them as a dynasty of evil, and boy, they sure were. Felix, the governor, holds the same position that was earlier held by Pontius Pilate when Jesus Christ was on trial before him. And he is the Roman governor over Judea. And of his character, the Jewish historian Tacitus wrote, "In the practice of all kinds of lust and cruelty, he exercised the power of a king and the temper of a slave." So the power of a king in that he had such great authority, but his temper was that of a slave, that he was just unbridled. The exact year of this trial and the subsequent events that we'll be covering in the book of Acts cannot be pinpointed. There is a disagreement among scholars, although none of them too authoritatively tries to nail down any date. So you have more of a range, and even in the works that I referred to earlier, nobody is able to really nail it down to the exact year. But this trial that we're looking at now took place, the best authorities would have it between 57 and 59 AD. Jesus Christ was crucified in 28 or 29 AD. So we're talking about basically now this event being 30 years after Jesus Christ's crucifixion, just to give you some kind of time frame when all this stuff is happening. The location for this trial before Felix is Caesarea. Caesarea is a chief city, but it's also, interestingly enough, not only the city where Felix resides, but a more notable person for us that resided there was Philip the Evangelist. And it is the same city where Philip the Evangelist lived, who Paul stayed with for many days just prior to going to Jerusalem. It is in the same city of Caesarea that Paul was warned time and time again not to go to Jerusalem. He was warned by the daughters probably of Philip, by others, and most especially Agabus the prophet, who came and took his girdle, the strip of cloth, and tied his hands and feet and said, "So shall the man who owns this be bound." And now Paul finds himself in that same city, bound, just like Agabus had warned him he would be, to stand trial before Felix. He should have listened. And there he is, having ignored those warnings that were given to him in the city, on trial before Felix. And we'll pick up the record in verse 1. "And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul." The elders refers to the rulers of Jerusalem. both who are the elders, both religious and governmental. These are the people that he was already on trial before when he was before the council or Sanhedrin. This is the chief priests and representatives of the Sanhedrin. Tertullus, it says in verse 1, this certain orator, basically think of him as the prosecuting attorney. He's brought in just to make the case against Paul. Verse 2. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee, addressing Felix, by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. He's really laid it on thick. And what he's saying, although definitely done to sort of curry favor and to get Felix on his side, but also to recognize that Felix is the authority here, that he's the one that's going to have the say. They tried to be the ones that had the authority, and it was taken out of their hands. And now whatever happens, it rests in their minds right now with Felix. He's the one in the power. They also know that the charges that have been brought against Paul, Paul's not the one that really was guilty of it. They were the culprits behind it. The rioting that occurred, that triggered all this, Paul wasn't the one that was the cause of it. They were the ones that had caused it. So they want to handle this in a way where they're very respectful and drawing his favor. What they're saying in terms of by Felix, we enjoy quietness and we're thankful, was a true statement. Felix had done a lot to establish law and order and peace to the region of Judea. They had been plagued by robbers, a revolutionary that Paul was mistakenly thought to be, the Egyptian, who was an insurrectionist, if you remember that when we covered those records. Felix was the one that had quelled all that turmoil. Continuing in verse 4, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious, which means to hinder one's way, unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency or fairness a few words. Saying, we recognize you're the one that's got the authority here. And we don't want to tie you up. We know you're a busy man. We know you got all kinds of things that you have to do. So we don't want to get in your way of other more important matters. So just let us kind of state briefly our case. Verse 5. For we have found this man, and now begins the charges that they're actually making against Paul, a pestilent fellow. Pestilent fellow. Pestilent means producing the plague or other malignant, contagious disease, noxious to health and life, has a pestilent air or climate, noxious to morals or society, destructive, making disturbance, corrupt. All of this from Webster's 1828 dictionary that defines words according to their archaic usage and even gives this verse as a reference in Webster's dictionary. The first charge is this, that Paul was a danger to society, one that could destroy the health and life of the Judean nation like a plague. Continuing in verse 5, and the mover of sedition among all Jews throughout the world. Sedition was one of the crimes, and it's the same word that's used, that Barabbas was charged with. Barabbas, who was released in favor instead of Jesus Christ when he was before Pontius Pilate. Sedition comes from the word stasis in the Greek. It's translated sedition, dissension, insurrection, uproar, or standing. Sedition, the crime of sedition presently, is a serious felony punishable by fines and prison time. Sedition is inciting revolt or violence against a lawful authority to destroy or overthrow it. So the second charge against Paul was one of sedition. Importantly, that charge of sedition isn't really against the Roman authorities, but the Jewish nation. Had it been against the Roman authorities, then that would have been a matter of breaking a great violation of Roman law. That's basically what Jesus Christ was nailed on as far as Pilate was concerned. Clearly there was an uproar. Clearly there was a riot, a great disturbance that happened. But was Paul the cause of it? No. It wasn't Paul. Continuing in verse 5, the next charge. And a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. The word sect is airesis in the Greek. It's 5 times translated sect and 4 times translated heresy. Just read you one other verse where it's used. You stay where you are. But in 2 Peter 2:1 it says, But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord had bought them, and to bring upon themselves swift destruction. Heresy. The word sect is the same as a heretic. And that was the third charge, that Paul was a cult leader, that he was guilty of heresy. And in verse 6, who also hath gone about to profane. That word profane means to desecrate the temple. This is the fourth charge, that Paul desecrated the temple. So just to recap those charges, and this is their case against him. The first one, that he was a danger to Jewish society. The second, that he was guilty of sedition against Judea. Third, that he was a cult leader, that he was a heretic. And fourth, that he had desecrated the temple. If there had been any real proof, if they were able to offer up any proof of this, of any of these charges, even though they weren't directly against the Roman government, then they still would have been able to make a case against Paul that the Romans would have had to take action on, simply because in Roman law, they protected the Jewish law. And especially the temple. The charge of desecrating the temple would have been a strong one, because the protection of the temple was specifically under the care of the Roman governor that was in that area. All the charges were false and no evidence was offered, except that Paul was a, quote, ringleader or leader of the Nazarenes. But that did not make him a heretic, as he'll defend. Continuing verse 6 of verse 24, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. We took him and we would have handled this whole matter. He was in front of the Sanhedrin. We would have judged him. But, verse 7, the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands. So we would have never had to bother you at all, Felix. We wouldn't be pestering you now about this whole matter if it hadn't been for your guy Lysias, who came and with great violence took him out of our hands. Verse 8, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things, whereof we accuse him. And all the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So here they are saying, we had this all handled, none of it should have ever got to you, and there was no reason for Lysias to come in and do any of this. Now, what they don't realize is that Felix has already read the letter that this fella, Claudius Lysias, sent when he sent Paul to them. This letter that not only described the events that they're referring to, but also the plot to assassinate Paul and their complicity in that conspiracy. So he knows more than what they think he knows. Verse 10, Paul begins to answer these charges. And the goal of their prosecution, Tertullus, the chief elders that have come down, their goal is not to get Felix to pronounce judgment against him, but to basically just kick this back into the hands of the Sanhedrin. That's what they're trying to do. And you can see everything they've done, and especially the way it concluded, was to basically just say, oh, okay, well, we'll just kick it back into your court, literally. The idea behind that is they are still trying to assassinate him. They are still trying to kill him. Verse 10, Paul answers the charges. Then Paul, after the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. All these things they're saying, I was only there simply just 12 days ago now. And they neither found me in the temple, disputing with any man. The idea that Paul was somehow a danger to society, corrupting society. He went there, he was in the temple, he wasn't going around trying to lead people in any way. He wasn't trying to spread anything evil amongst them. Neither raising up the people. He was not doing anything that incited the riot that ensued. He had not done anything to stir people up. Neither in the synagogues nor in the city. Not only in the temple, but he hadn't done anything in the synagogues or city at all regarding that. Verse 12. And they neither found me in the... Did I do that? Yes. Verse 13. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. They have no proof of anything that they've just said. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, the one thing that they say that I've done, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor tumult. So there he is. He's saying, yes, I have been a leader amongst Christians. But that's not heresy. What I'm preaching agrees with what is predicted, what is prophesied in the law and the prophets. This is the fulfilling of that. And this is in line with I'm teaching about Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And the resurrection is something that a lot of these guys agree with. Some don't. And Felix understands some of this stuff. And he says in verse 18 that they found him purified in the temple, showing that he did nothing to in any way defile or desecrate the temple. He did not bring in people that would have desecrated the temple, as the charge at the time was when they had supposed that he brought in an Ephesian into the temple. It's also interesting if you follow the records leading up to this, up until the time that all the way through to them arriving at Jerusalem, the plural pronoun we is used in describing the record, showing that Luke is with him all the way up to their arrival in Jerusalem. But when Paul goes into the temple, it switches from the second person, or first person plural, to then just talking about Paul. In other words, Luke is no longer includes himself in that narrative when Paul goes into the temple. Most believe that Luke was a Gentile. Now he might have been a Judean in the diaspora, but this could give credence to the belief that Luke was a Gentile, and that's why he didn't go with Paul into the temple. There were a number of other companions that Paul had been traveling with prior to his arrival in Jerusalem that are also no longer included in this narrative, that all were Gentiles. You have to go back to, I think, like Acts chapter 20 to get that whole list of 7 different people besides Luke that were all Gentiles, and Paul didn't bring any of them with him because he was going into the temple, and being sensitive and not wanting to offend them, he did not take any Gentiles into it. And before he himself went in, he purified himself. So there's no basis by anybody's reckoning that Paul could have done something to defile the temple. And he wasn't creating any tumult, any disturbance. Verse 19. Who ought to have been here before thee? These guys that are bringing the charges should be here, and object if they had aught against me. Or else let these same here say if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council. All these guys that claim that I have done this stuff, they're not here. And the fellows that are here, if they've got any proof, then let them offer it up now. Verse 21, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. The only thing that they can say that I did was that I brought up the resurrection, and that's what he did, if you remember, during the trial before the Sanhedrin. Verse 22, and when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the utmost of your matter. He stalls. He's just stalling. He doesn't want to pass any kind of judgment, and we'll see why in a minute. And he says, well, I want that chief captain of the guard, the one who pulled him out of here, to come and hear what he has to say. But Lysias never comes. I don't know that Felix ever sends for him. Verse 23, and he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. So there he is, again, God just taking care of Paul every step of the way. There's Paul. He's on trial. And certainly that's an ordeal. But Paul doesn't react to the situation. He does not react emotionally. Nothing he says is said out of anger. Nothing that he says in any way would indicate that. Nor is there anything that would indicate that he is acting in a manner of fearfulness or that he's depressed. None of those things enter into the way that he handles himself, because he is totally just trusting God in this situation. He's calm, he's collected, he's systematically answering these charges and trusting God to take care of him. And although Felix doesn't release him and stalls on the trial and won't release him for a good long time, we'll see this, nonetheless, this whole time that Paul is in Caesarea, he is just under the watchful eye of a soldier and a centurion, and he's allowed his acquaintances to minister to him and come unto him. And again, he's in the same place where Philip the evangelist and all these other people live, all these other believers. Verse 24. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, that's who I talked about, she's the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And he, Paul, reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way for this time. When I have convenient season, I will call for thee. So Drusilla wants to hear what Paul has to say about this, what he's been preaching. And he comes and shares these things that he's been sharing with everyone, the things concerning Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And it just kind of freaks Felix out, and he just sends him away and keeps him locked up. He says, when I have a convenient time, I'll call for thee. In verse 26, we see his motivation. He hoped also that money should be given of him, of Paul, and that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. He's looking for a bribe. He thinks, I'm not saying anything against you, Paul, but I'm not ready to let you go. Maybe there's something you could do to persuade me. And he brings them in time and again, hoping for money, hoping that Paul will offer him a bribe to be released. Because this is the way that Felix operates. Felix is a very corrupt leader. At this very time, Felix is under investigation by the Roman authorities for misuse of his office. And it's a good part of the reason why Felix will eventually handle this thing in the way that he does, because not only is he looking for a bribe, but he does not want to do anything as time goes on that would put his constituents, the Jewish authorities, against him when he has to go answer before the court of Caesar for the way that he's conducted his office. Verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. It means he took his office. Felix is replaced by Festus. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, that's what I was just talking about, because he wants to keep them on his side, left Paul bound. So Felix was recalled to Rome, and wanting that support of the people that he governed, he kept Paul locked up, even though he knew that Paul had done nothing wrong. And now this will be handed off to Festus, and we'll handle that next time, Paul's appearance before Festus. And I trust we'll be able to also handle the one before Agrippa. It's this period of 2 years that Paul is imprisoned here at Caesarea that not a soul is won to Christ. This is the period of 2 years where basically the real consequence of what Paul did happens. The real consequence being not just Paul being in the situation of being in bonds, which to him that was nothing new. That he all knew he was willing to do. Or having been put through the trials and all of the things that he went through. But more importantly, and you'll see this by the time we finish with all of these records, more importantly to Paul, he, in those 2 years, doesn't do anything to further the gospel. He doesn't do anything that accomplishes any more of moving the word and winning people to Christ. But praise God, that's not where things end. He will recover after those 2 years. God bless.